My guess is you've heard about the Trans-Canada gas pipeline that was being blockaded by eco-radicals, but I know for a fact you haven't heard this alarming side of the story yet. Chantal Belrichard, the CBC's resident Indigenous activist reporter, wrote this article about the pipeline blockade. A deal had been reached with the Wet'suwet'en First Nation to allow pipeline access. Hallelujah, right? Well, not really. The wording is really important here, so let's highlight that. The office, lowercase o, of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, capital WFN, in Smithers, BC. Okay, my fake news alarm is going off right away because I know that the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, just for starters, is not anywhere near Smithers, BC. We'll get back to this CBC News article in a second. Canada has had a troubled history of getting pipelines built. Everyone knows that. This pipeline that we're talking about right now is headed from Dawson Creek to Kitimat. It's taking a similar geographical route as a few other pipeline attempts. You might remember Northern Gateway. Yeah, well, it's the same line. Instead of oil, this Coastal Gaslink line will export Canadian natural gas. These are all the First Nations it runs through, and each and every one of these groups has signed an agreement accepting money and jobs in return for the pipeline. Every single one, including the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. But what about the Wet'suwet'en blockaders that were arrested by the RCMP for illegally contravening a court injunction? You must have heard of them. The mainstream media has been swooning over their plight for weeks, helping them drum up a patchwork of support all across Canada, fomenting protests in every major city. Using the Wet'suwet'en name, these eco-radicals have manipulated the public into thinking that the blockaders actually hold some sort of right to the land that the pipeline is being built on, when in fact all that they have done is set up a makeshift camp with their hands out, demanding any resource company that walks by them to cough up cash. They are a marketing gimmick and they're in it for the money. I called them and asked them, and they straight up admitted that they are a company.
Okay, so just to let you know, Keean, we're not a band. The band is an accessory of the federal government, which is located only on reserves, and we're the hereditary chief's office, and our chiefs are our board of directors for this company, nonprofit society.
I went on to ask this self-admitted company if they were behind the pipeline blockade at the makeshift Unistoten camp, and here's what they said.
Was that you guys that was organizing that?
Well, yes.
I guess they didn't know who I was. The thing is, the real Wet'suwet'en have agreed to this pipeline. Here's the agreement. Look, quote, on behalf of itself and its members, the chief signed and agreed to allowing the pipeline to be built through Wet'suwet'en territory, and in return, they receive employment opportunities and direct financial compensation in the millions of dollars. And don't worry, it is not just the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. Every single band along the route has signed an agreement just like this. The Wet'suwet'en First Nation, the real Wet'suwet'en, emphatically support this pipeline. Take a look at what the elected chief had to say about it.
And Chief, just how important are the benefits to your nation?
If we were to opt out of any pipeline deal, we would be just administering poverty. There's not enough revenue to go around to meet all of our needs. So we need to start doing something for ourselves, being able to stand on our own 2 feet economically, socially. When I'm done my term as chief, we're going to have, everything in place so that our community can flourish and, be self-sustaining, self-sufficient.
But this doesn't make any sense, right? Let's go back to the CBC article. It seems like there are two Wet'suwet'en, one that has legal agreement signed with TransCanada and has treaty rights, and one that has neither, but the media are reporting on anyways. Well, that's exactly the confusion that these blockaders are relying on, and exactly the same confusion that the CBC is all too happy to entertain. Let me break it down for you. There are two groups. They call themselves Wet'suwet'en. One is the First Nation that has an agreement with the federal crown and makes them treaty status. Their legal name is Wet'suwet'en First Nation. They have a couple dozen members and they elect a chief and council. Totally legit. The other Wet'suwet'en that the CBC used as the de facto authority of the area is an actual company, as they claim, made up of self-proclaimed, quote, progressive Wet'suwet'en working as one for the betterment of all. It sounds a little communist, doesn't it? To put that in perspective, it would be as if the United Nations was even more sketchy and illegitimate. Then they blockaded the Suez or the Panama Canals until shipping companies paid them for the privilege that was not theirs to grant in the first place. For the sake of clarity, we're going to call the legitimate group the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, and the Fantasy First Nation that has hereditary chiefs and has no legitimate claim to the land is called the Office of the Wet'suwet'en Society, or OWS for short. OWS, in their short time that they've been operating, has found themselves in mountains of debt, $14 million in fact, which came in the form of federal loans in the ballpark of $300,000 to $500,000 annually. These loans were given to OWS to facilitate treaty negotiations which were abandoned around 2008, 2009. Millions in outstanding debt is a heck of a reason to shake down energy companies. And again, to be clear, this group is not an Indian band or a tribal council or anything resembling that. By their own admission, listen to this.
The BC government website says that you're in stage 4 of the treaty process. So I'm just wondering if you can tell me if you guys have treaty status or what's going on there.
Yeah, so we're not currently negotiating in the treaty. So the treaty process has been stalled way back in 2009, I think, 2008.
Okay.
Or 2009. So essentially, we stopped negotiating treaty about 10 years ago.
It's just a group of people saying that they have some spiritual relationship to the land, the trees, the rivers. Now, what we found out about OWS is going to blow your mind. The story isn't just about how the CBC insidiously propped up a fake First Nation. The story is that this eco-radical front group is funded by Tides, an organization knee-deep in the anti-oil sands campaign. That's right, this patchwork of random activists who are just blockading a major pipeline are up to their eyeballs in eco-radical money. We went through all of their financial statements, and buried around the end of each of those documents for the last several years is Tides. To their credit, the OWS is resourceful, and they have lots of connections. It's not just Tides giving them hundreds of thousands of dollars that goes right into the pockets of the self-anointed hereditary chiefs. They have money coming in from all over the enviro protest industry. They have grants from the Forest Ethics Group, a radical group for the infamous Sephora Berman, the Pembina Institute, whose former executive director, Marlo Reynolds, is Catherine McKenna's chief of staff out in Ottawa. Not only are they getting revenue from eco-radicals, they've also landed $500,000 a year from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans through a program called the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, even though they only made about $6,000 in fishing revenue in 2015, and that number quickly dropped to zero in 2016. I guess eco-activism really just pays better. Look, now we know that this organization, the OWS, is a front for eco-radical money. So what are they doing with it, and how do they have any credibility whatsoever? Well, let's take a look at David Belford. He's the guy running their engagement agreements with energy companies that are building on what they call their spiritual and traditional land. Really? This guy is whiter than me, and that doesn't really scream spiritual relationship with the rivers and trees. This guy knows that the claimed land of the 20-something-year-old OWS company is high priority operating area for resource companies. It's right between the bear and her cub. There's valuable natural gas to the east, and the only place to export it is at Kitimat, which is to the west. The OWS is smack dab right in the middle. What a coincidence. You can see it right there on the pipeline map. Their claimed lands are conveniently located in a huge expanse east of Kitimat, acting as a plug to any development to the coast. Remember, it's not just Coastal Gaslink, it's Enbridge Northern Gateway and the Pacific Trails pipeline too. Each and every time, the OWS is there with enviro funding to stage protests, blockades, and most importantly, raise money to pay the salary of 20 full-time staff and the honorariums of several hereditary chiefs. Of course, this would not be possible. It just wouldn't work if the mainstream media didn't take the bait hook, line, and sinker. In the CBC's case, they swallowed the whole damn fishing rod. Now, let's go back to the first image. Do you see why it's so problematic now and purposefully misleading? These 5 men are actually on the board of directors of a company that is funded by Tides and has even more money coming in from the government. And they're just raising a fuss to raise their own profile and legitimacy, all thanks to the mainstream media that enables them. Just look at their faces. They know what they're doing. That guy biting his lip like that, I bet he still can't believe that he's gotten away with this for so long. Well, the buck stops here, and now you know the truth. For the Rebel.media, this is Keean Bexte. This expose would not have been possible without the research and files given to the Rebel by William Kay. He was a huge help in this story, and I'm especially grateful to him. You can find more videos just like this at The Rebel on YouTube. Be sure to hit that red subscribe button under the video so that you can stay up to date with all of our coverage.